Johnny Carson's animosity for his work was fueled by 8 late-night guests. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson was the unrivaled master of late-night television. Over 4,500 episodes of The Tonight Show went by without a hitch for Carson, thanks to his Midwestern charisma, perfect timing, and characteristic eyebrow lift. He seemed to have an uncanny knack for effortlessly welcoming A-listers from the worlds of entertainment, politics, and sports night after night. Carson seldom let the public see the real dissatisfaction and even rage that lay beneath that flawless suit and flawless smile. Although the majority of guests were familiar with the unspoken guidelines of The Tonight Show, a handful of them managed to push Carson's renowned patience to its limit, resulting in an unbearable level of tension. The 8 guests who made the most unflappable presenter on television secretly fear having them on stage are finally getting their due today. Neither of these things was a simple interview or a dull discussion. Even though Johnny Carson loved his job more than anything else in the world, those encounters caused him to briefly despise his profession. Some might have been more hands-off. Some people were totally unruly. While some were out to cause trouble, others just failed to gauge the atmosphere. One thing, though, was common to all of them. What should have been painless television became agonizing orals for the man behind the desk when they broke Carson's meticulously preserved balance of spontaneity and structure. If you stick around, I'll tell you more about Carson's perfectionist streak, his fears, and his dreams for television than you'd find in a typical highlight reel from The Tonight Show. Here we have Johnny Carson in a rare form, being driven to the brink of collapse by guests who utterly failed to grasp or show any interest in the nuanced art of late-night banter. The fact that no American servicemen are now fighting any war anywhere in the globe is really significant. This is just one more reason why Bob Hope is present. To Bob Hope, Carson's show was nothing more than a billboard. Bob Hope was the embodiment of American show business aristocracy, a legendary figure in the world of silent film, television, and vaudeville comedy. He became a hero to many servicemen during his USO trips. His holiday specials became a staple in American culture. To most viewers, Hope's performances on The Tonight Show felt like a logical marriage of comedy titans, a torchbearer from one period speaking with his worthy successor. Behind the scenes, however, these appearances had become torturous for Carson and his crew. By the 1980s, Hope had changed from a vivacious comedian into something more akin to a corporate brand. A legend trading on previous grandeur while going through increasingly mechanical movements. Hope would waltz on to The Tonight Show to promote specials and golf tournaments, delivering nothing spontaneous, refusing to engage, and insisting on cards, recalled a former Tonight Show producer. For Johnny, who prized honest interaction above all else, this approach to television felt like a personal insult. The troubles began far before Hope ever arrived at the studio. While other guests worked via the show's usual booking process, Hope's staff would basically dictate when he would attend, expecting the show to fit his schedule regardless of prior commitments. Once these appearances were planned, Hope's writers would submit a stack of cue cards containing prepared responses that often had little resemblance to the questions Carson would really ask. There was no conversation, explained a longtime Tonight Show crew member. Johnny would ask a question, and Hope would look down at his cards and deliver whatever line was next, regardless of whether it answered the question. It was television at its most artificial, and Carson hated every second of it. What made these interactions particularly frustrating for Carson was the contrast between Hope's approach and his own philosophy of television. Carson believed in preparation, but also in the wonder of spontaneity, the unexpected moment, the genuine laugh, the authentic emotion. Hope by the 1980s had abandoned any semblance of spontaneity in favor of carefully choreographed appearances centered completely on promoting his next special tournament or project. Carson rarely expressed his emotions publicly, keeping the deferential manner needed when dealing with a legend of Hope's prominence. But in a rare moment of candor during an interview with TV Guide, Carson confessed his genuine feelings. He just has to show up with a golf club and a Reagan joke and he's on. He doesn't have to be hilarious, and I detest that. This anger eventually led to an exceptional decision that was never formally disclosed, but became an open secret within NBC. Sometime in the late 1980s, Carson discreetly barred Hope from The Tonight Show, a surprising move given Hope's iconic status and long association with the network. It was never officially stated, revealed a top NBC executive from that period, but people inside NBC understood Hope was persona non grata on The Tonight Show. The instruction was clear. Don't call Hope's people, and if they phone us, claim we're completely booked. For a host who had established his reputation on diplomacy and professionalism, This behind-the-scenes ban indicated just how deeply Hope's approach to television had hurt Carson's sensibilities. It wasn't only that Hope was promoting himself. All guests did that to some extent, but that he regarded The Tonight Show as little more than a billboard, delivering viewers no genuine moments or actual interaction in exchange for the platform. When Carson resigned in 1992, Hope was glaringly absent from the farewell presentations honoring Carson's favorite and most memorable guests. The comedic legend who had once been a Tonight Show staple had been essentially removed from the program's last chapter. The ultimate indicator of how utterly Carson had abandoned Hope's approach to television. Would you please greet Mr. Warmth, Don? Applause, Don Rickles, too wild for Johnny's rigorously regulated format. While Bob Hope represented the problem of a guest who was too controlled, Don Rickles provided Carson with the opposite challenge. A hilarious hurricane who would blast into the studio and upend Carson's meticulously planned structure within seconds of taking the stage. Known as Mr. Warmth, a severely sarcastic moniker, Rickles had built his career on insult comedy, hitting audience members, fellow celebrities, and presenters with rapid-fire insults that somehow managed to be both cruel and loving. When Rickles arrived on The Tonight Show, all customary protocols went out the window, including Carson's role as the one in authority. Rickles was crazy, loud, and unpredictable, recalled a former Tonight Show director. Carson enjoyed dry, controlled discussions, not being roasted or steamrolled. They were pals, although Carson sometimes refused to have him on solo and exclusively scheduled him in group portions. The typical Rickles visit would begin traditionally enough with Carson introducing him and Rickles strolling out to greet the host. But within moments, Rickles would take control, pulling Carson's tie, swiping his cigarette, or springing from his chair to address the audience directly. Often he would steal Ed McMahon's microphone or commandeer Carson's desk, literally and figuratively displacing the host from his primary position. Rickles would hijack the desk and Carson would retreat into a phony smile, said a cameraman who worked on many of these episodes. If you knew Johnny well, you could see a certain tension in his jaw, even as he was laughing. He acknowledged Rickles' talent, but hated losing control of his own show. Sincere friendship and professional regard for Rickles made Carson's reaction to him more nuanced. Rickles, in contrast to Hope, whose performances seemed robotic and transactional, possessed the inimitable charm and impromptu nature that Carson cherished. No, the issue wasn't that Rickles lacked interest. Carson found himself in the odd position of taking a back seat on his own show due to his unique brand of comedy, which demanded that he dominate every conversation. A solution emerged from this dynamic that showed Carson's smart approach to dealing with challenging guests. Carson frequently requested that Rickles participate exclusively in panel parts with other guests instead of outright banning him. This setup made Rickles less of a star by providing him more people to trash and less room to shine. If Don's coming on, make sure we have at least 2 other guests that night, Johnny would instruct the bookers, according to a staffer of The Tonight Show. This was his strategy for controlling the Rickles tornado, as it allowed it to aim for multiple targets simultaneously. The iconic incident when Rickles shattered Carson's cigarette box while guest hosting and the subsequent on-camera confrontation between the 2 hosts during Rickles' dinner at a restaurant were both born out of the tension between Carson's methodical approach and Rickles' chaotic energy. These instances were effective because they constituted infrequent lapses in Carson's meticulously preserved poise. A real affinity between the 2 guys set the Carson-Rickles connection apart from previous challenging guest scenarios. Carson saw the comedic brilliance in Rickles and knew that his act necessitated a certain amount of lethargic performance. When Rickles saw that Carson was becoming visibly uncomfortable, he showed enough respect for the host to rein in his most aggressive instincts. They had an understanding, an acquaintance of theirs explained. Rickles had more leverage with Johnny than nearly anybody else, yet he was still aware of when to stop. A little distance would be enough for him to notice if Carson was really tensing up. 2 skilled dancers performed a comedic routine. Rickles managed to stay a regular on The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure by maintaining this fine balance, even if he would occasionally make the host look uncomfortable. Talent and enthusiasm, not ego or embarrassment, were the sources of Rickles' disruptions, in contrast to a few of our other guests. Even if it made him despise his profession for a little while, Carson, being a student of humor, obviously acknowledged and valued the difference. Even now, they're applauding the monologue. The question of who penned "How Are You, Madonna?" was actually going through my mind. The visitor who flat-out disregarded his regulations. By 1987, Madonna had gone from being a dance pop novelty to a contentious cultural symbol and a worldwide phenomenon. Having gone from Lucky Star to Like a Prayer, her Who's That Girl Globe tour was selling out stadiums and establishing her as an artist determined to control her own image and story. In July of that year, she made an appearance on The Tonight Show, and viewers saw a clash of two radically different perspectives on fame. Madonna's daring, boundary-pushing persona contrasts with Carson's calculated Midwestern reserve. A writer for The Tonight Show who was there at the time recalled that she was sexually provocative, rude, and self-promotional, and that she made jokes about Johnny's private parts that made him chuckle awkwardly. In retrospect, he admitted to his pals that she was among the few guests who truly made him feel like he wasn't in charge anymore. As soon as Madonna sat down, the established power structure of The Tonight Show was disrupted. Madonna frequently responded to Carson's inquiries with sexual innuendo or intentionally offensive answers, leaving Carson visibly embarrassed, instead of respectfully answering them. Instead of letting the topic go to her professional achievements, she veered off course and started talking about scandals and provocations. Pay attention to Johnny's body language during the interview, advised a body language specialist who has researched Carson's hosting approach. To put some distance between them, he leans away from her. He can't even bring a smile to his eyes. When someone takes great satisfaction in being unflappable, these are classic signs of discomfort. The fact that Madonna purposefully undermined the Tonight Show formula made her performance all the more difficult for Carson to handle. Even the most unruly guests eventually came to terms with a few unspoken guidelines. Together, the host's questioning and the guest's humorous responses make for a fascinating session. By completely rejecting this model, Madonna portrayed Carson as an establishment figure to be attacked rather than a host to be revered. An official from NBC who was there that night indicated that Madonna had an agenda. Neither promoting a project nor participating in the usual talk show small talk were her intentions. She hoped to spark an emotional response and start a conversation by being there. She was incredibly successful in that regard, but it was at Carson's sacrifice. The encounter became even more intricate due to the gender dynamics at play. Carson had made a name for himself by interviewing stunning female celebrities, frequently with the kind of subtle flirtatiousness that was all the rage back then. Madonna completely flipped the script, using the opportunity to manipulate the sexual tension in a way that clearly unsettled Carson. A female writer on the show made the observation that Johnny was accustomed to being the one who could make a provocative joke or seductive comment. He was obviously at a loss for words when he found himself unexpectedly on Madonna's receiving end of such energy. The effect was the same as seeing the dance floor leader suddenly pushed to the sidelines. After the interview, Carson allegedly told his producer, "Let's not do that again." He didn't outright exclude Madonna from future appearances, but he did make it apparent that he didn't want to repeat the experience. Later on, when Madonna's representatives wanted to book another appearance on The Tonight Show, they were kindly but firmly informed that their schedule was already packed. The Madonna interview is a remarkable cultural artifact because it captures a point in time when a new wave of celebrities, represented by Carson's reserved, almost formal style, confronted the established entertainment industry with a new wave of provocateurs and trendsetters. Although he remained composed throughout the segment, Carson's close friends and family could tell that the incident had shaken his confidence and sense of control on his own program. "Is Truman Capote someone you'd welcome?" "I am doing good, Truman. Please pardon my tardiness. I am currently settling in." Al Pacino, slurring, impolite, and intoxicated. In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's cemented Truman Capote's status as one of the most accomplished American authors of all time. His public drunkenness, sour feuds with old acquaintances, and unpredictable behavior at social occasions had already made him famous by the time he made an appearance on The Tonight Show in the middle of the 1970s. Carson had one of his most difficult interviews with him, and spectators got an unsettling look at a creative talent deteriorating throughout his appearance. According to a stage manager who was present that night, Capote seemed visibly drunk, provided responses that were difficult to understand, and made Johnny feel uncomfortable throughout the live broadcast. Among Carson's notorious train disaster interviews, this one stands out. Disinvited at every turn. Nothing was right from the minute Capote stepped onto the stage. It was practically hard to follow his train of thought due to his slurred voice and unstable motions. Asking direct questions on Capote's past and future work, Carson, ever the consummate professional, sought to steer the conversation toward more logical ground. Interspersed with inappropriate laughing and non-sequiturs, Capote's responses were at times meandering and incomprehensible. Ex-Tonight Show producer Johnny had a method for handling challenging guests, the source said. Shortening the program and using simpler questions, he would attempt to rescue the interview by highlighting some facet of the guest's personality. Those methods failed miserably when used to Capot. The man's impairment rendered him incapable of carrying on even the most basic of conversations. During the course of the conversation, Capot grew more antagonistic and made derogatory comments about several celebrities and writers, including a number of Carson's pals. He implied that Carson had the mental capacity to engage in deep discussions about literature, which was a disparaging remark about Carson himself. Carson's expression, a tight smile and a brief peek toward Ed McMahon, clearly conveyed his unease. According to a camera operator's recollection, Johnny was contemplating cutting the part short. That authority was his. If things were going south, he could just end them. Meanwhile, he was highly professional and believed that it was the host's responsibility to make every visitor, no matter how challenging, appear good. It became an insurmountable challenge when dealing with Capot. It became even more uncomfortable due to the audience's reaction. People thought Capot was acting or being intentionally provocative for laughs at first, which led to some awkward laughter. As the segment progressed and his disability became more apparent, the laughing subsided and was replaced by an anxious quiet, occasionally broken by nervous titters. Even while Carson avoided talking about the Capot interview in subsequent years, his behavior made it quite evident. The Tonight Show never invited Truman Capote back. "I think we've had quite enough of Mr. Capote." Carson would merely shake his head and remark this whenever Capote's name was mentioned in production meetings as a possible guest to promote future books or appearances. This particular challenge is exemplified by the Capote interview, which Carson encountered repeatedly throughout his career. What to do with visitors who obviously had drug misuse problems? Guests who may have had a few too many before appearing on the show were usually sympathetic to Carson, a host who enjoyed drinking himself and was known to be empathetic to performers suffering with personal issues. Capote, however, went beyond drunken clumsiness to open hostility and incoherence, producing television that was not only uncomfortable but downright unwatchable. According to a Carson buddy who has been there for a while, Johnny thought the viewers were tuning in to see entertainment, not a public breakdown. Having Capote on the show wasn't simply terrible television. It seemed exploitative, like taking advantage of a person who obviously needed assistance instead of attention from a camera. Things went against Johnny's morals to a degree that he was unwilling to tolerate. While Carson did encounter this issue on occasion throughout his career, the Capote event was the most severe manifestation of it. The difficulty of getting to the heart of complicated, smart people whose personal problems occasionally overcame their professional achievements in interviews. Even while Carson was quick to cut off guests who were being annoying or self-indulgent, he had real empathy for people fighting inner struggles. Even if, as happened with Capote, they briefly made his job intolerable. We stepped inside and noticed that, although the outside was stunning, the temperature was a chilling 10 degrees below zero. Shelley Winters, the incessant chatterbox. After launching her career as a stunning blonde Anu, Shelley Winters won 2 Oscars and became one of Hollywood's most revered actors by embracing a more serious dramatic role. Additionally, Johnny Carson found out from her many visits that she was one of the most draining guests in the history of Tonight's Show. A lady whose rambling, unstructured way of speaking stretched even Carson's renowned tolerance to its limits. A Tonight Show associate producer recalled that Winters was a chronic interrupter, strayed from the subject at hand, and delivered jokes that were unsatisfactory. When she started going off on tangents, Johnny would literally shrink back. Even though he allegedly asked producers, "Why do we keep booking her?" Winters was a regular on Carson's Tonight Show, making multiple appearances throughout his time there, in contrast to some problematic guests who only appeared once and were never called back. Carson knew exactly what to expect every time she took the stage because of all the exposure she has had to her unique conversational style. The usual pattern of Winters' appearance was predicted. Carson would try to set the tone for the talk with a simple opening question. When Winters started to answer, she would suddenly start babbling about an ostentatiously irrelevant subject, usually involving one of her infamous exes. Carson would try to return to the initial subject, but Winters would cut him off with another digression, starting a linguistic ping-pong match that the host rarely emerged victorious from. A cameraman who had worked closely with Johnny Carson for many years described how Johnny could physically detect when he was losing a guest. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, he would begin to tap his fingers on the desk. The majority of visitors will only appear in a part once or twice. It was almost non-stop with Shelley Winters. Winters' seeming insensitivity to social cues was the most difficult aspect of dealing with her. Carson would attempt to end a story that had dragged on for too long, but Winters would continue as if nothing had happened. She would speak over him whenever he attempted to ask a question. Every time he changed his body language to indicate that he was ready to go on, she would sit down even more firmly and start telling another long story. According to an observer who has been Johnny's audience member for many of Winter's performances, you could sense the inner conflict radiating off of his face. While he never really said anything disrespectful, there were times when it seemed like he was going to storm off the stage as soon as she finished telling stories. It was no secret that Carson was secretly quite frustrated with Winters. He would go back to his dressing room after really draining periods and inquire, "Why do we keep booking her?" The response was straightforward. Winters was a major player in Hollywood with real achievements and fame, despite the fact that she caused conversational mayhem. It would have been considered rude to a real celebrity to openly ban her. Rather than that, Carson planned out how to handle Winters' appearances. Later on, when time was more limited, he would schedule her for periods when her digressions would be more naturally ended. To moderate her domineering tendencies, he would occasionally group her with other visitors for panel discussions. He also perfected a more forceful method of interrupting Winters, stepping in more strongly than he did with other guests. Unveiling the Shelley procedure, designed by Johnny, was uncovered by a former Tonight Show writer. Johnny is free to cut her off more suddenly than he would with other guests, and the portions are shorter. The questions are also more direct. Though it never really fixed the issue, it did help with her outward appearances. Despite his private dissatisfaction, Carson kept a friendly contact with Winters throughout his career, which is an intriguing aspect of their dynamic. Despite her distracting speaking style, he acknowledged her talent and achievements. The way Carson prioritized the audience's experience and the dignity of his guests, even when it challenged his own tremendous patience, is exemplified by this professional respect maintained despite personal irritation. Average folks. The word has some foul taste, so we don't use it when it starts with an M. Even Carson couldn't stand Dick Shawn, I said. There was a special place in American humor for Dick Shawn, an artist who, with his surrealism avant-garde style, challenged the boundaries of what was considered funny by conventional audiences. Famous for his portrayals on Lorenzo St. Du Bois LSD in The Producers and the hippie actor portraying Hitler in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, Shawn frequently strayed from conventional stand-up comedy into more performance art-like realms. While this strategy was spot on in other settings, Shawn found The Tonight Show to be an especially difficult platform for his unusual style. According to a comedy historian who has researched Shawn's career, the comedian was recognized for his surreal, performance art-level antics that puzzled and embarrassed the audience. Johnny had no patience for performers who saw the performance as an experiment in themselves. Shawn was not one of our more problematic visitors because of a lack of humility, substance misuse, or dominance in discourse, unlike a number of others on our list. Instead, his performances tested Carson's mettle since they went against the grain of talk show conventions, frequently leaving the host and viewers bewildered by routines that appeared to be meant to produce more confusion than laughter. When Shawn appeared on Carson, it would usually start off like any other talk show, with Carson introducing him and trying to strike up a conversation. However, Shawn would soon turn the tables on the audience by answering simple questions with lengthy silences, abrupt character changes, or abstract monologues. His use of the full stage space and his occasional forays into the audience for seemingly impromptu physical acts made Carson's producers anxious. According to a previous Tonight Show director, Johnny loved audience-connecting entertainment. When it was appropriate, he could appreciate sarcasm, subtle humor, and even absurdism. However, rather than entertaining, Shawn's content frequently appeared to be deliberately meant to turn off his audience. That was counter to Carson's entire television philosophy. Body language and facial expressions betrayed Carson's uneasiness during these parts. Although he kept his composure and gave Shaw her due, fans who are familiar with his hosting manner could see the relief on his face and the tension in his smile as her parts ended. Carson would often try to re-establish the show's vitality by making a brief joke to Ed McMahon after very abstract appearances, subtly acknowledging the audience's perplexion. Johnny would say things like, "Well, that's certainly one way to look at it, Dick. Or I think I need to lie down after that one," recalled a longtime viewer. It was his way of gently signaling to the audience that yes, what they just witnessed was unusual, even by Tonight Show standards. Behind the scenes, Carson was more direct about his frustration. According to staff members, he once told his producers that Shawn treated the show like their own private experiment rather than respecting the format and audience expectations. While he recognized Shawn's talent and originality, Carson felt that The Tonight Show, broadcast to millions of mainstream viewers across America, was not the appropriate venue for comedy that was deliberately challenging and obscure. Despite these frustrations, Shawn continued to appear on The Tonight Show periodically throughout Carson's tenure. This reflected both Carson's respect for Sean's place in the comedy world and the show's commitment to representing a wide range of comedic styles. But these appearances were carefully managed, typically shorter than average, often positioned late in the show, and frequently followed by more conventional guests who could reset the show's energy. Sean's case illustrates an interesting tension in Carson's approach to comedy. While Carson himself had an appreciation for the absurd and the unconventional, his own Karnak, the magnificent character, incorporated elements of surrealism. He believed strongly that television comedy needed to connect with the audience rather than alienate them. Performers like Sean, who seemed more interested in challenging viewers than entertaining them, represented an approach to comedy that Carson respected intellectually but found frustrating in practice, especially when it was his job to maintain the flow and energy of a show watched by millions. That it can play various parts. I suppose you could have your Crisin Glover, the guest who nearly got punched. On July 28, 1987, viewers of The Tonight Show witnessed one of the strangest and most uncomfortable interviews in the program's history when actor Crisin Glover, best known at the time for playing George McFly in Back to the Future, took to Carson's stage in platform shoes, a wig, and bizarre attire, seemingly inhabiting a character rather than appearing as himself. What followed was nearly 6 minutes of increasingly tense television that culminated in one of the few moments when Carson appeared genuinely angry on air. Glover showed up in character, spouted nonsense, then tried to kick Johnny in the face during a demonstration. The clip went viral. Carson looked furious, recalled a staff member who was present that night. He nearly walked off mid-in. The appearance began strangely and quickly escalated. Rather than engaging in normal conversation, Glover fidgeted nervously, spoke in a strained voice, and responded to Carson's questions with non-sequiturs and incomprehensible statements. When Carson, attempting to salvage the interview, asked about Glover's upcoming film projects, the actor pulled out a pair of clippings from old magazines and began reading random passages aloud. Carson, visibly confused, but maintaining his professional demeanor, tried to establish some kind of conversational rhythm. But the breaking point came when Glover suddenly announced, "I can kick," and stood up to demonstrate, delivering a karate kick that came alarmingly close to Carson's head. The host's reaction was immediate and uncharacteristic. He physically recoiled, his face registering genuine anger rather than the mild annoyance he typically displayed with difficult guests. "I think I have to go check on the chicken backstage," Carson said curtly, beginning to rise from his chair as if to walk off the set. He ultimately remained, but the message was clear. He was on the verge of ending the segment immediately, something he rarely did, even with the most challenging guests. The audience reaction matched Carson's discomfort, with nervous laughter giving way to awkward silence, as it became clear that Glover's behavior wasn't simply eccentric, but potentially hostile. Ed McMahon, usually ready with a supportive laugh or comment, sat in uncharacteristic silence, watching the scene unfold with visible concern. As the segment mercifully concluded, Carson made no attempt to hide his relief, turning to his next guest with a pointed comment about returning to our regularly scheduled program. During the commercial break, according to staff members present, Carson was visibly shaken and angry, demanding to know how such a booking had been approved and making it clear that Glover was not to be invited back. Years later, it would become apparent that Glover had been appearing in character as Reuben Foray, a role he would play in the 1991 film Reuben and Ed. At the time, however, neither Carson nor the audience had any context for the bizarre behavior, creating one of the most genuinely uncomfortable moments in the show's long history. Johnny valued guests who understood the collaborative nature of talk show appearances, explained a longtime producer. Even difficult or eccentric guests usually maintained some awareness that they were part of a show with established expectations. Glover completely rejected that understanding, treating Carson's stage as a platform for what was essentially an unannounced performance art piece. The Glover incident stands apart from other difficult guest experiences because it contained an element that was rare in Carson's interactions, a flash of genuine anger rather than mere frustration or discomfort. While Carson prided himself on his ability to handle any situation with grace and humor, Glover's physical actions, particularly the kick that came close to his face, crossed a line from merely bizarre to potentially threatening. In the aftermath, NBC executives reportedly contacted Glover's representatives to express concern about the appearance and make it clear that he would not be welcomed back on The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure. While Carson rarely banned guests outright, the Glover incident represented an exception, a case where the host's personal safety had seemed momentarily at risk, transforming standard interview discomfort into something more serious. The clip has since become legendary in talk show history, frequently appearing in compilations of the most awkward and uncomfortable television moments. For Carson, however, it represented something beyond mere awkwardness. A rare moment when his legendary composure cracked to reveal genuine anger at a guest who had violated not just the unwritten rules of talk show etiquette, but basic standards of personal space and safety. Oliver Reed. The interview Johnny refused to air. That he does one of the three. He's Oliver Reed. The interview Johnny refused to air. Oliver Reed built his career playing intense, often menacing characters in films like Oliver, Women in Love, and The Devils. His off-screen reputation was equally formidable. A hard-drinking hellraiser known for pub brawls, outrageous behavior, and an almost pathological disregard for Hollywood conventions. When Reed appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 1970s, Carson found himself face-to-face with a guest who not only challenged his hosting skills, but triggered one of the rarest actions in the program's history, the decision not to rebroadcast a segment that had already aired live. Reed, the intense British actor, showed up belligerent and intoxicated, slurring through answers and arguing with Johnny on air, explained a former NBC executive familiar with the incident. The segment was never rebroadcast. Rare for Carson. That one doesn't get a clip reel, he told the staff afterward. From the moment Reed walked on stage, it was clear something was amiss. His gait was unsteady, his speech slurred, and his demeanor combative. While Carson was no stranger to guests who had had a few drinks before appearing, this was the 1970s after all, when pre-show alcohol consumption was not uncommon. Reed's level of intoxication went far beyond the typical loosening of inhibitions. The interview quickly descended into chaos as Reed ignored Carson's questions, launched into rambling anecdotes, and occasionally made aggressive statements toward the host. When Carson attempted to steer the conversation toward Reed's film work, the actor responded with increasingly belligerent non-sequiturs and at one point what appeared to be a veiled threat. Johnny had techniques for handling drunk guests, noted a former Tonight Show director. He would simplify questions, pick up the pace, sometimes even turn the intoxication into a joke if the guest was good-natured about it. But Reed wasn't just drunk. He was hostile, confrontational, almost looking for a fight. None of Carson's usual strategies worked. As the segment progressed, Carson's discomfort was palpable. His usual relaxed posture gave way to a more rigid stance, his familiar smile tightened, and his eyes frequently darted off camera, presumably seeking guidance from his producer about whether to cut the interview short. The studio audience, normally reliable for supportive laughter, even during awkward moments, fell increasingly silent as Reed's behavior became more erratic. Carson managed to conclude the segment without any complete breakdown, a testament to his professional skill, even in the most challenging circumstances. But immediately after the show, he made an unprecedented decision. The Reed interview would not be included in the rebroadcast that aired in later time zones and would never be included in any Best of Carson compilations or clip shows. That one doesn't get a clip reel, Carson reportedly told his staff. A simple statement that conveyed the depth of his discomfort with what had transpired. In an era before YouTube and social media, this decision effectively erased the interview from public memory, with only the live Eastern Time Zone audience witnessing Reed's behavior. The Reed incident illustrates an aspect of Carson's hosting philosophy that set him apart from some of his contemporaries and successors, his belief that genuine discomfort and hostility were not entertainment. While other hosts might have replayed such an interview for its train wreck appeal or milked the controversy for publicity, Carson saw nothing valuable in showcasing a guest at their worst, particularly when that worst involved behavior that crossed the line from eccentric to genuinely unpleasant. Johnny believed the audience tuned in to be entertained, not to witness someone humiliating themselves, explained a longtime friend of Carson's. He wasn't interested in the kind of gotcha moments or public meltdowns that later became staples of certain talk shows. If a guest self-destructed on his stage, he saw that as a failure, not content to be exploited. Reed was never invited back to The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure. When his name would come up in production meetings as a potential guest for subsequent films, Carson would simply shake his head and say, "I think we've seen quite enough of Mr. Reed." It was a rare instance of Carson explicitly blacklisting a guest, a decision that reflected not just personal dislike, but a fundamental belief about the kind of television he wanted to create. For a host who endured thousands of interviews across 3 decades, the decision to effectively erase one from the record speaks volumes about how deeply Reed's appearance had violated Carson's standards for his show. It wasn't just that Reed had made Carson's job difficult. He had created a type of television that Carson found antithetical to his entire approach to entertainment.